So hi everyone, thanks for coming along. What I'm going to do tonight is just talk a little bit, very briefly, about that session that Matt mentioned, that is where the idea for this session came from. I'll talk then mostly about some research that I've been doing since then, and then I'll leave you with a question for the interactive discussion in the second half. So I'm going to ask the question to you, but then I want you to just think about it and also still listen to the rest of what I say at the same time. Think you can do that? Yes, I like to set you a challenge. So, as Matt said, the idea for this session, it started right here, or somewhere sort of roundabouts, just over a year ago, and it was an Information Innovation Meetup event last February, and the topic was called Government Information Accessibility. What are the issues and challenges? There was this really fantastic panel of speakers that are listed up there on the screen. We had Kate and Elizabeth representing views from inside government and also from a regulatory perspective. And then we had Matthew and Maureen representing views from civil society and academia or research. And among the different issues and challenges that were discussed in that session were things like politics and power dynamics, laws and policy frameworks, lack of resources, poor information management, technology, and knowledge and skills both for staff in the public sector and also for members of the public. So I'm sure these kind of issues probably sound quite familiar. So do they resonate? Issues we've talked about before? Certainly I've heard them before. And so I wrote an article summarising it, and the link is on the blog page for Information Innovation, along with the slides and videos from that session. So if you want to really see what was the content discussed there, I'd encourage you to go and dig into that a bit more. But I'm not going to talk about challenges. I want to talk about where do we go from the challenges. And there were several things that really stood out for me during this session. So the first thing that stood out for me was that we were all on the same page. It was a pretty well attended meeting, and everyone in the room was agreed that open government and information access were important and worthy things. So there wasn't any debate about that, and you could say perhaps we were just preaching to the choir by the nature of the people who came to the event. But secondly, we were also all agreed that it was broken, or at least not working as well as it should. And most of the issues and challenges that were raised are things that we've been talking about for a really long time. And thirdly, despite all this agreement that we were having, there was still this adversarial feeling, this kind of tension in the room between views that were coming from inside government and those views coming from outside government. And there was clearly sort of a lack of trust between these different sides, or at the very least a lack of understanding from each about the challenges faced by the other. So these are the things that struck me. And as I said, last year's session focused on issues and challenges, and with this session what we want to do is reframe that discussion in terms of opportunities and possibilities. So we want to move the conversation forward beyond challenges towards solutions. And after that meetup last year, I just felt there had to be a better way, a different way of thinking about the problem that we're trying to solve, because I felt we've been thinking the same way and it hasn't led to any different results. We've had laws and policies in place for decades. There are people who have been born since the Freedom of Information Act was introduced, either in federal government or the New South Wales one that preceded GIPA. So there are people working in the public sector who were born after that act was introduced. The requirements have been established for their whole lives. Right? It's not a new thing. And yet it still hasn't become business as usual. It's not something that's embedded in the culture. So I started to do some research into the space, and my baseline questions really were, how do people think and feel about openness? Because that's what drives their behaviour, right? How they think and how they feel. Where do the views of different stakeholders diverge? So where is that lack of understanding happening between the stakeholders, and what could we learn from that and from each other? And what could we do that would make people feel differently and think differently about openness to try to encourage more open behaviours? So those are the questions that came to my mind. And the approach that I've taken to the research is all the things you would probably expect. Desktop research to learn about clever ideas that other people already thought of. Hanging out with cool people like May and Mel through the Open Government Partnership. I've also spoken with regulators in different jurisdictions and digging through the published data about information access. So they're all readily available sources. And then with support from Objective, I was able to commission some research through Intermedium. Does anyone know Intermedium as a research company? So they are focused on public sector IT. That's the kind of papers that they write. And their research included interviews with senior executives in the public sector, so just bringing that business perspective to bear. And then the work I've been doing most recently is more at agency level or council level, working with local government as well, which is analysing processes and systems that support people in doing open government activities. And so the things I'm looking for is anything that could impact culture and the way that people think and feel about openness, as I said. Anything that could act as a catalyst for change. Now, one of the suggestions that came up last year event was that there needed to be stronger penalties. You know, people that aren't doing the right thing, that aren't performing, need to be punished. And I noted earlier this year as well, the UK Information Commissioner was considering developing a report card to, quote, name and shame agencies that are slow to respond to requests for information access. And I don't know how you feel about these, and I think, again, maybe that depends on whether you have that inside or outside government perspective. But I personally think that change works best when everybody can see the benefits and agrees that it's a good idea and they want to get on board. So that's the angle that I've been focusing on. Now, Dr. Tali Sharrett is a behavioural neuroscientist at University College London, and in a TED talk that she did in 2014, she notes that neurologically, threats are poor at affecting change in behaviour. So I crossed off the idea of penalties and shaming report cards. The things that she says are good at influencing behaviour are social incentives, which also includes things like benchmarking, progress monitoring, and the ability to assume some control over your progress, and also immediate rewards for behaviour that yields long-term benefits. So these are the kind of things that can make change in our brains. And so I started thinking, well, what would benchmarking look like in this space? And how would progress monitoring work if we're not doing report cards for naming and shaming? And how could we better connect people with the benefits of openness? If those rewards are things that drive change, how can we connect people with the benefits of openness and reward them for open behaviours? Now, all the different stakeholders involved in open government, whichever part of it you're operating in, they're all doing this balancing act, right? So members of the public, they're going to look at how much effort does it take them to search or make a request, and they're going to balance that with what kind of information are they going to get back. Is it going to be what they want, and do that balance. And staff in agencies and councils are doing the same kind of thing. They're thinking about how much effort is going into releasing information, and then what's in it for me. And what's in it for me could be, is it going to help me meet my business goals and KPIs for today? You know, is it going to help me get where I need to be? Is it going to deliver something meaningful for my organisation's customers or community, right? Those are things that are meaningful to me as well. Or will I be recognised, or will my effort be recognised for what I've put in to deliver these benefits for someone? Now, the interviews that were carried out by Intermedium, as I said, they included senior executives in the public sector, and some of those executives had responsibility for informational technology, but others were responsible for policy and service delivery. So there's a range of views coming to bear. And this goes a little bit to the idea that leadership is often a challenge in making change. And although those executives agreed that openness could build trust and it could contribute to a range of benefits, there was still a lot of concern about the cost of the activities that support openness. So from the perspective of an agency or an individual staff member, there was a feeling that a lot of effort and resources are invested in openness, but they don't seem to return a corresponding level of public value. And certainly as a senior executive in a public agency responsible for taxpayers' money, you want to spend that money where you think the most return is going to your public constituents. So this is certainly one of those areas I talked about where the views of the different stakeholders diverge, and you can see that in the quotes. So it seemed to me that we have a mismatch in the way that we measure and assign the weight on each side of this balance. And we talk about the benefits of openness, we usually focus on the broad impact for democracy or the whole economy, right? And that's good because we want to benefit those kind of things. But those benefits also need to be aligned with defined outcomes that someone's responsible for, right? Because that's going to set responsibility for achieving it, but it's also going to bring the rewards for achieving it. It needs to be set in the context of the investment that a person or an organisation has made. So here are some examples that you might be familiar with from your own experience or research. There was a 2013 study by McKinsey that estimated the global economic value of open data to be up to $4 trillion per year. Wow, holy cow. And a 2014 report from Lateral Economics estimated the value of government data to the Australian economy somewhere between $500 million and $25 billion. So we're talking about huge value, right? Wow, imagine, why aren't we just getting on with that then? Okay, and as a bit of a contrast, in January this year, the United States signed into law the Open Government Data Act. Now, that requires agencies to catalogue and release all public data online in machine-readable formats, and it also anticipates a really wide range of benefits for the whole of the US. However, the Congressional Budget Office scored the cost of that legislation as negligible and stated there was no significant impact on government spending. How do you feel about that?
It's amusing.
Yeah. Yeah?
I'm just wondering if the US is really the best benchmark for government.
or openness at the moment. But the point being that, and if I go to the next, what we're looking at here with these examples is we're giving this huge amount of weight to those benefits, right? Saying, look at the massive amount of weight and value that they can deliver. And it's not going to take really any investment, not much effort, not much time, money, people, commitment. It's just going to be pretty easy. Now, it would be great if that were true, and we talked about the issues and challenges why it might not be the case. But the fact is, by just not realising that this is not an accurate balance, that's not going to help us make change and bring people on a journey. So those outputs are just outcomes are so high and broad, they're not connected with the organisations and people that are really essential for making this change happen. But these are the things then that would make it meaningful and worthwhile for them to participate. So what if we could more easily connect people with the benefits and outcomes of their actions? Could it change the way that they feel about openness? That was my question. So that's actually my question for you, to be discussed in the second half of this session. What do you see as the biggest benefits to agencies? So bring our thinking down. What's the benefits to agencies of greater openness? And how could we measure it and provide fast feedback to the organisation or to the people involved? So have a think about it. And if the second half is a bit boring, you can come back to this. So now on the other side of that seesaw, when we talk about the costs of openness, we usually focus on then the resources that are invested by an organisation. So we've gone from the whole world or the whole entire economy down to one organisation. And we might look at it as, say, a percentage of their total expenditure, or alongside another expense of a similar value. So this particular example comes from the UK, and a couple of things that they've pulled out here to compare FOI spending as it is there. So business innovation and skills spent the same amount on FOI as on ministerial cars. And people are, whoa, okay, well maybe that's not really a lot of money then, or maybe it is. The communities and local government spent less on FOI than they spent on catering. Culture, media and sport spent way less on FOI than they did on the Olympic logo. And about the same in the Cabinet Office, that similar amount on FOI as the retirement benefits for a senior executive. So that's one way of looking at it, but it's not really an accurate comparison because all these other expenditures are linked to a defined outcome for the organisation or its customers, and then we can judge if that's good value, right? Is that a really good amount to spend? £400,000 on the Olympic logo? I don't know, but at least you've got something to put it against. Whereas with the general figure on FOI spending, I have no idea what value was returned for that investment. So I can't tell you if that's good value or not. Comparing it against what we spent on something else isn't relevant. Another way that we look at the cost to try to say is it really that big a deal is we look at a cost per request. But that's not linked to an outcome or an impact either. So again, there's no way really to tell if it's good value or not. And cost per request are averages across agencies that have really different profiles and across requests that have really varying levels of complexity. So any of these kind of average cost per request is unlikely to reflect the reality of a particular organisation. Doesn't account for opportunity cost when staff are diverted from core business activities. It doesn't account for whether an agency is running an efficient process for information release or how many staff are involved. And it doesn't tell them how they're doing and whether or not they could improve. There's nothing there for them to work from. But what if you could measure the investment in openness for a particular agency rather than relying on averages across the sector? And what if you could see exactly where the most time and effort was being spent in that agency and identify areas for improvement, where there are bottlenecks in the information flow, where staff need training or support? What if you could capture the amount of time and effort different individuals invest in openness activities and perhaps measurably reduce it in a way that they can see and give them more time back to work on higher value tasks? So thinking about Dr. Tali Sharrett's recommendation about benchmarking and progress monitoring, would it change the way people think and feel about these activities? So this is exactly what we've been working on with the process analysis research, and people have responded very positively to the idea. But the more data, the more value when it comes to benchmarking. So the people who put their hands up as public servants, if you're interested in participating, I'll share a link at the end of the presentation. But behind an average cost per request, for example, depending on an organisation, their average could be as high as $4,000 per request, or it could be less than $100, right? So you can see how this $1,500 is not relevant to their situation. And some of the other most striking findings include the amount of time people spend on reporting, keying data into multiple systems, and simply administering the process, all of which could be better spent on consultation, balancing interests, and faster responses. So one participant that we spoke to said he sometimes felt like a duck. So appearing to bob placidly on the surface of the water with everything under control, but below the surface, paddling madly to keep afloat. And bringing transparency and recognition to this effort, I think, can really improve the way people feel and help make the case for change. So there's a great story on Simon Sinek's book, Start With Why. Has anyone read that book? Start With Why? Yeah? And he talks about a group of American car executives that went to Japan to see an assembly line and see how it was done in a different place. At the end of the line is the place where the doors get put onto the cars. And it worked, they get put onto the hinges, right? And it works just the same as they do that in America. But there seemed to be one bit missing. So in the United States, the line worker, once the door was there, the line worker would take a mallet and just hammer around the edges of the door with this rubber mallet to make sure that it fit absolutely perfectly. But in Japan, that job didn't seem to exist. So the American executives asked their counterparts, at what point do you make sure the door fits perfectly? And the Japanese guide looked at them and smiled a bit sheepishly and said, make sure it fits when we design it. So in the Japanese auto plant, it didn't examine the product and figure out how to reshape it for what it needed to be. They engineered the outcome that they wanted from the beginning of the process. And if it didn't achieve the desired outcome, they realised that it was due to a decision that they'd made at the start of the process. So doors need to fit by design, not by default. Just assume it's going to come out and fit, right? Openness can only become part of organisational culture by design, not by default. That's why after 30 years, it's not embedded in the culture. Can't just expect it to be there by default. We need to re-engineer openness to achieve the desired outcome and not keep hammering the numbers to fit. So our goal here tonight is just to stimulate discussion and different ways of thinking about how to encourage greater openness. Reframe the discussion, as I said, in terms of opportunities and possibilities. So in summary, what my proposals are, that there's a disconnect between the effort agencies invest in open activities and the benefits they or their customers recognise. That there are some simple ways that we can start to rebalance this equation, and that doing so would make a significant impact on open behaviours.
Thank you, Sonya.
The research is ongoing, and I encourage anyone from a government agency to participate in the process analysis and benchmarking. Thank you.
Okay, and next up we have May Miller Dawkins. Now,
Can I ask a question?
sure, fire away.
So not for